Before I give the floor to the keynote and I open the session for the keynote presentation, just a broad overview of what the day is going to be like. So the day is going to consist in 4 sessions. So the first session will be the keynote presentation. The second session will be maybe the ones some of you are expecting eagerly, which with updates from the data producer, the LFS team, as well a presentation about recent challenges which you may have heard of, experienced by the labor force survey. And after that presentation, we will say goodbye to our online followers and have a panel discussion about the data. Then we will have the lunch and the 2 paper sessions in the afternoon, focusing on different aspects of labor market and kind of analysis done with the LFS. Okay, but without further ado, now it's time for me to introduce our keynote speaker. So I'm really delighted here to introduce you or to present Professor Heejung Chung. So who, even though I know she has a very busy diary, accepted to come and join us today. So I'm going to read through her comprehensive or really impressive bio. So Heejung is the director of the King's Global Institute for Women's Leadership, which is just next door. And she's also, and obviously that's the reason why she's here as well, is a professor of work and employment at King's College. She's a comparative labor market researcher with a strong focus on flexible working, home remote working, basically also gender and the labor market and gender equality. And I should probably add, she's too modest to say, but she's she has become one of the leading scholars in the field, in this field. So she has 2 decades of experience of research and teaching, both nationally in the UK or internationally, and also collaborating with the OECD, EU, DIU. And she has a lot of publications. I'm not going to go through them on the topic. If you want to hear more about her research, you can follow her on or have a look at her website, heejungchung.com, or just maybe have a word with her after the session. So today, Heejung is going to talk to us about and give her insight about rethinking work and how to measure work in the age of remote working, digitalisation, and always on work culture. So Heejung, the floor is yours now.
Thank you. Oh, we pull that up. I'm hoping that the mic's not working. I think it is. So Pierre and I know each other for 2 decades. So this was probably the closest thing to a best man speech. Yeah. Because yeah, it is. The thing I'm like to I've been asked to do the keynote speech, but also I usually kind of go and do a speech around my book, which is the flexibility paradox. For those of you who haven't seen it, go buy it or get your libraries to go buy it for you. But he actually gave me a really tough homework for the last how many weeks on, oh no, you have to also talk about measurement. This is the LFS conference. You have to talk about the LS and how you use it, but also how you can make it better. So it was like, I've been like, you know how like with some students, there's like this huge homework with a deadline, and it was, impending doom, and I had a really hard time. And because the submission date is today, so I've submitted it. But as you have, I don't know, many of you teach, but as you have probably seen with some student essays, or you have probably written some yourself, the content is there. I'm not sure about the structure, so I'm not sure if I'm going to get a first in this presentation, but at least hopefully with a very patient and grateful, gracious audience, I'm hoping that you'll give me at least a high 2-1 with this. So, okay. So just the starting point. So a lot of the work that I conduct is about flexible working, future of work, etc. And as you know, flexible working, remote working has like really rapidly increased over the years, probably more than we have ever anticipated due to the pandemic. With that, we see a huge rise of digitalization of work, etc., which really allows you to pretty much like carry your office with you in this little box all the time, which can potentially be like a utopian dream, like, oh, I could work anywhere all the time. And I've actually heard people talk about, oh yeah, they're going to be working in Dubai, or not Dubai, sorry, it was like even a Bali for 6 months, because if you're remote, why not? Also, you could work while like at your child's like football match or at their swimming, essentially you kind of provide this utopian working arrangement. But having said that, it also brings, oh God, that person's now hidden, for the kind of a new world of work where the boundaries between work and non-work becomes ever so increasingly blurred. And it's flexible, but it's also very, very blurred. And it also, we're seeing a pattern, and I think most of you are part of kind of an example here where work encroaches upon your life. Not just even your waking life, but even your unconscious time as well. In things, for example, dreaming about work and having work stress encroaching on your kind of sleeping and other rest times. And so I wanted to kind of, so the book was really about that a little bit, and is trying to explain why that happens. So essentially when bound, can we, this is very, I did it just go like that. So when the boundaries between work and private time becomes blurred and flexible through these arrangements, that this paradoxical pattern that we see, which is where workers end up working harder and longer. And this is perhaps amplified through the digitalization of work. So rather than flexible working leading us to work anywhere and any time we want, it actually ends up with working everywhere and all the time. And in the book and the research I conducted in the last kind of 10, 15 years was really about how also that varies across gender, because, and as a good sociologist, my work is really about explaining how a lot of what we have, a lot of the arrangements we have do not operate in a vacuum, but it is embedded in our social norms about how we think about work and how we think about gender. So that is kind of what the book is about. But because, again, the homework that I was given is that, okay, in that environment, knowing this, knowing what we know with the whole flexibility paradox or kind of the blurring of boundaries, then the second question, which isn't in the book, which is why I struggled, is how do we measure it? So if there are these issues with regards to work being now something that's going beyond this Taylorist, office-based, machine-based work, and it's digital, it's amorphous, because it's a lot of it's knowledge work, then what are we measuring? What can we measure? And I'm going to try to bring those into this the talk. And Pierre told me I have 45 minutes, and being a good academic, I think I have probably slides to last me about 2 weeks. So if I do have a lot of slides, just bear with me, and I'm going to just skip a few, but I'm just trying to capture these two things at once. So this is what we're going to do. Some definitions. I'm going to show you the rise of remote working. And then from there, I'm going to look at some of the patterns and issues with measurements, kind of looking at LFS, comparing it with some of the other data sets that are really widely used. And then talk a little bit about the benefits of remote working, because I think that's quite important for us to identify. So the whole talk shouldn't be like, yeah, we should have stricter boundaries. This is it. No, that's not what we're talking about. We want to talk about the benefits, then talk about the problems, and then really start introducing you to the point about that blurring of boundary leading to work being everywhere all the time, where we essentially are, in some ways, we are being kind of pushed to the idea that you are, once you're employed, you don't have boundaries. Like all of your waking and even unconscious time is blocked by your employer. So kind of introducing those things and how that then manifests themselves in terms of things around like working hours, long working hours, but also about digital presenteeism based on some of the recent data collected. And then kind of moving into that second bit. So there's 2 bits of measurements. One is about remote working. What should we do? The second bit is about with the digitalization blurring of boundaries. What is work? Like, how do you define it? What do you measure, etc. So unfortunately, the second, third bit of benefit problems of flexible working, the flexibility paradox. I'm going to go really quickly, but those of you who are really interested in that thing, again, buy the book, but also there's also other videos of me talking about it. So yeah. So flexible working. So there's two types of flexible working that I'm talking about. There's the blurred boundaries of time and space. So time is like flexible starting and ending times of work. So you don't have 9 to 5. You could do 10 to 6. You could do 8 to 4. Whatever you want is flexible. Flexi time has a little bit more boundary because it's a little bit clear that you have weekly hours. Working time autonomy takes it even further, and that's kind of a lot of what researchers or even academics have, which is essentially you do the work you need to do. I don't care when you do it or how long it takes, right? It's kind of like project-based. So it goes beyond this kind of flexible, just starting and ending with fixed hours. Teleworking, we all know, is essentially working outside of your normal space, and it could be at home mostly, but also it could be in a co-working space, what have you. Just to give you a bit of an understanding of how widely this is used. So across the European 28 countries in 2015, it was about a bit more than a quarter of the working population, employed working population. Obviously, self-employed is a completely different ballgame because you're your own boss. So, but for employed people, it's about 25%. UK is about 30%. Now, I do think this number would have increased over the 10 years because it's been introduced more and more, especially with legal changes, etc. But if you look at Sweden and Denmark, you see that it's more than 50%. So a lot of people say, oh, yeah, but flexibility, you can't be, not everybody can use it. Well, actually, flexible schedules, if you wanted to, you could literally have any work have some sort of flexibility embedded into it. May it be flexi time, may it be working time autonomy, or self-roastering, etc. So it is a quite widely spread arrangement. Looking at teleworking, this is from the European Working Conditions Survey 2021. The 24 data is not available yet. So they have and I'll talk a bit later. So do you always partially or occasionally work from home? And you see that even at this point, this is 2021, like later 2021, not early 2021. And it's, UK, Sweden is still like 50% plus of workers were working from home, although that varies quite significantly across Europe, and it's about 37.8% as a European average. Now that number has dropped a little bit, but it's still at a very high level. And UK is, I think, a colleague at King's also published a report just recently showing the UK is probably the #1 global leaders of remote working. And that is thanks to our wonderful leadership during the pandemic, who has enabled us to be locked up, perhaps longer than some of our counterparts. But I wanted to also highlight this bit. So this is the LFS data. So it's a very, I think this is a very interesting thing about surveys so the LFS data, as you all know, asks, where do you work? Where is your main place of work, right? Now, remember 2020, April? This is when it was like a total lockdown, right? And everybody who could work from home had to work from home. And if you look at the other surveys, it's about 50% of the workforce were working from home, right? Now, if you ask people, what is your main place of work? You see that before the pandemic, it's about 5-6%. This is male people, right? And even then, most people thought that their main place of work was the office, right? And it's quite clear. You know why? It's because we're just working from home as an alternative to the office, because I need to go into the office 5 days a week, but it's just a fluke. Now that fluke is like people start changing their minds a little bit. 2021 July. Do you guys remember what that is? Day is? You guys are real quiet. Is it too early? Have some coffee. Hey, what? Remember July 2021? What was it? It was Freedom Day. Do you not remember this? Have we all gone into some sort of group amnesia about this? We were locked up in here, right? But then in July 2021, this is actually where you see a huge number of people start saying, oh, actually, home is the main place of work. Because that's when they realize, like, oh, actually, home working is something that's going to stay. Because the lockdown measures were ended, and Boris Johnson at that time said, oh, we're not going to do any more lockdown measures. But people were still working from home, right? And that's actually when you see people be like, oh, okay, we're not going back. And you see that kind of stability there. Although there is a little blip here, and I expect you to explain that, why that is, because I don't think there was anyways, let's just leave it like that. But, and again, this also is another indication of like, what is home market, how do we measure it, and how that kind of perception of main place of home is quite interesting. And this is from, again, from the ONS, an opinions and lifestyle survey about where in 2021 April, which is still in that kind of lockdown period, if you were asking people, I usually mostly work from home or sometimes the usual place of work, there's only about 30, but then people will start moving towards more by 2022, more of the idea that, oh, actually, I work from home, like home working is now going to stay. And this is a pattern that's just kind of been observed. Obviously, I just wanted to show a couple of papers because I think Pierre told me to do it, so I'm very I am very adherent to the briefing that I was given. So obviously there are some differences across groups of workers. And one of the things we did for the Journal of Industrial Relations was to look at the ethnicity variation. And one of the things people don't do is this, is like people tend to not look at ethnicity variations because, well, one of which is because the data is not available. This is why we're so grateful that the elephant is so huge. It's large enough to, especially if you time pool a little bit, which we did, that you get enough data points to be able to look at ethnicity variations. And I know that this graph is quite difficult to see, but the key message here is that, thankfully enough, it doesn't seem like the rise in home working didn't seem like it was just driven by a group of ethnicity. So it does seem like majority of ethnicities, as you can see, has had an increase in home working, which is great. And actually, if you look at it here, especially, if you look at white versus this is Pakistani, Chinese, Black communities who are at the lowest levels of home working, that gap, that significant gap reduces, although the error terms gets larger, but you know that gap reduces. And if you see like mixed Indian race groups, that they're actually much faster growing in terms of home working. The male population a little bit more than the female population, but anyways, but there are still groups that are lagging behind, and mostly it's the Chinese and Black men who are the ones that are still kind of lagging behind. And of course, the inevitable one, this is, I think, another recent report using kind of LFS was reported like last week or something about how, you know, there are going to be variations across occupations because, you know, there are certain jobs that cannot be done from home, right? That's just how it is. Having said that, I think it's really also interesting to see that there are occupations, especially the first kind of 4 or 5, where you would think, oh yeah, how could that be done from home? But you do see proportions, and I think those proportions are rising because I think also the nature of some of these jobs, and this is this group here, service sales, right? This group is going to change dramatically, I think, in the next year because service sales is no longer going to be face to face. A lot of it will be online, and it will be done much more in this remote manner moving forward. So, anyways. That's that. But the other thing I wanted to highlight through this is that this is looking at male and female. So female are the greens and the men are the browns. And there are variations, but also you see that there are variations across occupations in terms of the gender gap that you see. That there are more managers that are female managers work from home, but the male managers don't. And that has implication for gender inequality, which I'll show you later. But anyways, going back. So about measuring homework, and so LFS actually, you know, the main place of work is great because I think, you know, it has a huge amount of data and is able to kind of do a lot of different things. And I'm going to show later how it marries up with the UK household panel in terms of usage and availability data as well. But one of the problems that we're seeing now is that majority of workers are now dividing into kind of like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 days. And the LFS main place of work is not really capturing the 1, 2 days that we're seeing a lot of. And we see a lot of people are doing kind of the return to office method, right? So what we're seeing less of is 5 days and 4 days, but a lot of kind of 2-3 days. And then the question is like, where do they fit in if in terms of the main place of work? Of course, there's another question, which is like, have you worked at home in the past week? But which doesn't also fully capture the pattern because it might be one, like, it doesn't really say it during your, does it say? Like, it might be doing kind of additional work, but also it doesn't necessarily, I think, capture that regularity in terms of that kind of what we consider hybrid work. And as I mentioned here, see, if you see the pattern here, I mean, it's not very clear in this, but the home working from 2022, this is based on the survey of working arrangements and attitudes. You see that home working as a whole hasn't changed much at all. But what has changed is that you are seeing a little bit more of these kind of 1-2 days and the reduction of the 5-day working from home. But also one of the reasons why we need to kind of compare the 1-2 days between the 3-4 days is because of this. So this is based on a vignette survey. The UK data was measured through the UK household panel, innovation panel. So for those of you who want to use it, it's there available for you to use. So please go ahead. So we've conducted some vignettes where we post a hypothetical worker. Oh, this is Charlotte Davis. Charlotte is a mom of 2, and she has a master's degrees. And then we said, oh, Charlotte works on site every day. So in the employer office. Oh, Charlotte works 1 or 2 days from home. Charlotte works 3 to 4 days from home. And then we compared how people perceive their commitment, motivation. Would you recommend Charlotte for promotion, right? And what happens is that when people work from home, and this is 2023, so this is already when home working is very normalized and everybody's working from home, that there is biases against workers, even having control for everything else, just based on their home working patterns. Because it is based on this idea that home working is slacking. Why? Because it just assumes that it is done for family purposes. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. I might go into a bit later. But the key thing I want to show you here is it is really important when people have these biases, how many days people work. So the 1-2 days and 3-4 days is quite significantly different, especially in Germany, but also in the UK. And I'll show you later as well. It also depends on how it is branded, who is working those 1 and 2, 3 days as well. So these distinctions are really quite important. And these are just some of the other ways in which the other survey data have been measuring it. So the SWAY data, the survey of working arrangements and attitudes, which I am a part of, although I haven't designed that actual question, is like we're looking, oh, are you doing working 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 4 day, 5+ days? Now that is a bit problematic because not only is it assuming you're all full-time workers, but it also doesn't account for different work schedules, such as condensed hours. The EU LFS divided into sometimes, usually, and never. Obviously, like that also is a bit awkward because what does that all mean? Like they do say that usually is kind of like 3 to 5 days, and sometimes it's kind of 1-2 days or less. But that's still a huge variation. The working conditions or European working conditions from Eurofound decided to use fully, partially, occasionally, never, or every day, several times a week, 7 times a month. Yeah, I don't know. Anyways, and then the UK HLS obviously has availability and use. And I think this is also another point that I wanted to make. One of the things we don't have with the LFS is about availability, or do it? Maybe I don't know enough. If anyone hears me saying something rubbish, can you just correct me instantly so that we don't carry on, because it might be like I just don't know the data well enough, because obviously I have the experts here. But what I do want to say as a thematic expert to say that availability of the arrangement you think is not important unless the people are able to use it. But now, actually, if you look at a lot of, especially like home working arrangements, etc., the whole availability in itself is a huge asset to workers' perceived work family integration. So the availability data, in a way, is really important. And then some other issues to consider, and this is based on this paper that I just quickly highlighted, is also some of these kind of questions we need to answer is how many days is your employer asking you to come in and how many do you come in? Because now, especially with this return to office mandate, what we're seeing is employers have policies. So it's about availability, but also how many days you need to have to come in, how many days are you coming in? And looking at the sway data, what we see is that we do see some variations in terms of that. So workers may not necessarily come in as often. And those kind of data is quite crucial to, I mean, it depends on how you measure it, but what the outcome is, but it's quite important in terms of, again, that stigma, the career outcomes, as well as actually maybe later the well-being piece. The other part is about degree of control, like who gets to decide how flexible is this? So we're doing some work around anchor days where now increasingly companies are setting days of you need to come in at certain days. And this could be a beneficial thing because it allows people to come in on the same day, which has efficacy in terms of in-person engagement, but also, you know, obviously kind of reduces flexibilities workers have. So having strict in-office days and having flexible in-office days are also very, very different in regards to working conditions and the perception of the worker. And then the other issue, which I think the Eurofound people, the working conditions survey is actually capturing, is about now that home is the office, we need to now start capturing the working conditions at the home, right? So the questions then is like, do you have a space? Is it isolated? Do you have a separate office space? What is the environment? Because we are quite good in terms of measuring some of these kind of health and safety issues in the office, but then sometimes then when the office space goes into the home sphere, how does that then marry up is another question. But okay, now back to the practicability paradox, which is I'm used to. I'm gonna go really quickly into this because I wanted to kind of highlight the back bit more than the front bit. So now moving away from the measurement issue, I just wanted to talk a little bit about flexibility, the good, bad, and the ugly. So first is about the good. So flexible working, the great thing about flexible working, one of the things that we're really interested in, especially now with the government's kind of obsession with productivity and inactivity, is that home working and other types of flexible working allows workers who are unable to be able to take part in the labor market to take part in the, or take part in the labor market in a better way. So, for example, flexible working, flexi-time, and teleworking allows mothers to not only stay in employment, but also work more hours, according to many of these studies, including mine. This is same for disabled workers. I did some studies for ethnic minority workers, but also workers with caring responsibilities. Essentially, it is allowing us to make better use of the labor force. It also can allow for better well-being because it reduces commuting times, or workers are able to better kind of combine work with family demands. But also, workers are generally happier. Why? Because, okay, better work-family demands, of course, work-life balance is good, so like a big thing, but also workers love autonomy and control, which helps increase loyalty, motivation, commitment for the job, which also, you know, directly leads to kind of less stress and better well-being. The one of the patterns we found, however, it depends on the gender, and I'm going to kind of show you some recent studies we did, again, using the LFS on this. A lot of studies on the positive sometimes looks at women and be like, oh, women are not getting as much of the kind of the benefits out of it. So, and I'm not going to go into details of this. So we wanted to look at this whole well-being and gender. So why are women not being able to reap the benefits of remote working compared to, let's say, men? So, and one of the best data that we could use in a longitudinal perspective is the UK household panel, which is as an individual with, you know, embedded in a household. The problem with that is that it only measures flexible working every 2 years. So it doesn't allow for that kind of year-on-year change. So what we did to also, it also doesn't necessarily, it has a problem with the selection effect, where people may select into remote working due to their health status. So if you're healthy and you could work better and the employers allow you to work from home, that's one selection effect. But if you're unhealthy and you need to work from home, then that's another selection effect. But so what we did was we matched the LFS with the household panel on the 4-digit occupational level to see whether the occupational level work from home changes, which is less likely to do with selection effects, improves individuals' well-being outcome. Oh, I forgot to put one graph in there. One of the things I did want to say, and if anyone hasn't done it yet, so we mapped out, first of all, whether the LFS data, mainly working from home, marries up with the household panel availability and use. And thankfully enough, it marries up. So you can see that the rise in, that pattern that I showed you in the LFS data with that kind of curve, that's the same pattern you see in the household panel data. So that change in that slow, weird rise in 2021, 22, that also works. And then the level that we see in the household panel as well as the LFS, there's a little bit of a variation, but it's actually like, to be honest, it's pretty good in terms of that marrying up. And of course, it the covariance it's quite high as well. But anyways, going back to that well-being, I wanted to show how for men we've seen a benefit, and this is before the pandemic. After pandemic, it changes a bit, but just for the before pandemic, when there is a benefit in well-being, but for women, there isn't, although there's a variation across different occupations. I'm not going to go into too much detail. And one of the reasons for it, and one of the reasons why well-being doesn't necessarily, you don't see the benefits in well-being, is because flexible working makes work harder and longer. We've looked at UK household panel, the German household panel, etc., to look at how when you start blurring boundaries with work and family life, people end up working harder and more. So in the German data, we looked at flexible schedules rather than remote working, because remote working at that time was such a small data point, so we couldn't really look it was harder to look at these changes. But what we see is that like for men, working time autonomy, moving from fixed schedules to working time autonomy made them work 2 hours longer overtime compared to for women. That was about an hour and a bit, hour and a half. This is a working conditions survey. So remote workers are more likely to think about work when not at work and work during their free time. And I think, most of you would have experienced this. And there's various reasons behind it. One is just because the boundaries are so blurred that it's really hard to distinguish between those two, which is something I'll come back to. But it's also because we live in what we consider, like in the Foucauldian idea of subjectification, as well as the kind of spirit of capitalism book, that we're living in an era of internalized capitalism. And the ideal worker image is one that where our self-fulfillment is only related to what we do. Some people say that it actually is because work no longer pays, that we have to find fulfillment or reasons to do work that goes beyond pay and security. But either way, we're in a position where when work and private life boundaries are blurred, we are expanding our work rather than expanding our leisure times due to that kind of internal need to be hustling. And also, especially if you're working on for all of you, very passionate careers on a certain thing that you think helps society. And there's this thing called passion exploitation, where if you're passionate about something, like in academia, you shouldn't get remunerated and you should really be able to do it due to your passion, so that there's an internal drive to do more work rather than do less. So obviously, under those conditions, flexible boundaries means that workers are pushing themselves to do excessive workload. Now, some people might say this is maybe only for the professionals and higher occupations. But that's actually not the case, because if you look at job ads for any occupations right now, even waitressing or, or cleaning, yeah, you'll see passion kind of embedded in, like, devotion to clients, or, like, these are really embedded in any occupation, including very routine occupations as well. And obviously, this is exacerbate that flexibility stigma and insecurity. So one is that even in now middle-class jobs, research, academia is one of them. We are seeing higher, not only rates of competitions, but insecurity in terms of job contracts, as well as the security of the institution as a whole. And it's also exacerbated by that flexibility stigma, that notion that, oh, if you're working flexibly, if you're working from home, you're not really working, you're looking at homes under the hammer or Netflix, right? Which again goes against the evidence that I've shown. And what I wanted to say here, I don't think I really need to say much here, because it's not really the point of today's talk, is that for women, that pressure comes in two directions. So they have to do more paid work, but also unpaid work. So they're feeling more pressures to do housework and childcare. And this means sacrificing their personal leisure time. And this is essentially explains why we don't see that association, positive association between remote working and well-being for women. I might just skip this because it's not so important, because I think I'm also quite running out of time. So I'm going to skip into this. Now, under that context of kind of flexibility paradox, where, when you give that blurring of boundaries, unlike this whole notion that, oh, people are going to slack off, people are not actually doing their jobs, people are going to take naps, which is essentially all of what I said was like headlines from some of the key newspapers in the UK. Along with that, and the digitalization of work. So digitalization of work, surprising. I mean, I was surprised at this myself. Like now, like work is really digital. It's like work, everything we do, even like, again, routine occupations. 80%, see the colors that you see, the dark ones is 80%, often or always are on using digital technology, right? Because that's like most of Europe, with the exception of some Eastern and Baltic countries. And 60% of workers across the US always are on some sort of device, right? Now, what that flexibility paradox and digitalization has then resulted in is this whole notion of digital presenteeism. Digital presenteeism is a behavior of employees who feel compelled to maintain a constant, instant, and visible online presence in the digital workspace. And even when it's unnecessary, both during and outside of normal working hours. So you've seen headlines like this. Oh, employees check their emails on holidays. People check emails on the weekends or in the evenings. People, are logging on to work all the time. And here, let me just say this. How many of you, you'll get your phone after work, like after 6 o'clock? Check your work email or work messaging or whatever. Okay, you switch it. Okay, how many of you do it on the weekend? Oh, yeah, really good. Okay, how many of, is it just, wait, like this part of the room, who are you? Why are you not raising your hands? Is this the ONS? And how can I work in the ONS? Okay. Okay, and holidays. How many of you, okay, how many of you bring your laptops on holiday? Okay, fewer, but I wanted to say this, you are not alone. But it's absolutely, it's a pandemic in a way. It is very widespread. It is not only professional workers, and when I say not only professional workers, the one group that is really feeling the pressure of this being always on, like kind of, it's like gig economy workers. Because for many, bogus self-employed gig economy workers, being able to check on your phone, being on the phone is a matter of getting a job or not. So, and I mean, this could be Deliveroo, but it could be any kind of self-employed kind of freelancer as well. being there is not just about, like having a professional thing and, being able to show like professionalism, which now, again, that instant, constant reaction to your email is seen as a level of professionalism. But it's also a matter of having a job or not. And because with a lot of gig economy workers, there is no stability in the jobs that you get, your ability to get there first determines the amount of work and success you have, right? So again, digital presenteeism is huge. And again, this is, I've only been able to look at gender, parental status, and ethnicity. But one other big group that we need to really be cautious about, and some colleagues, especially in Melbourne University, have been doing this, is that lower occupation gig economy workers, precarious workers, because they're now at the front line of being able to almost drop out of the labor market altogether if they are unable to perform this presenteeism. So again, we use the sway data to see how prevalent this is. And this is about how often do you send emails after, outside of what's normal hours, how many times do you read emails, and how much do you feel that pressure to be always on? Good news is about 50% seem to be relatively protected. But then we have another 50% who feel sometimes or always, just often always feel pressure to be. And again, this is not just outside of working hours. It's not just like responding at 8 o'clock. It also is like, during the work day, like being on your email all the time. So making sure that within the hour, you're sending emails back to colleagues or messages back to colleagues. So there's like, that's a huge proportion of workers who feel this way. How many minutes do I have here? Because I'm getting confused as to when I was supposed to stop.
So you're stop it, yeah.
Okay, so maybe I'll just push this in. The reason why people do this is because, like, it's good for your internal kind of career, but that's also because they know that if they do this, this will be seen good by the managers. Now, the irony is the manager, if you ask the manager, hey, and I'm a manager, do you want your colleague, your employees to work, in the evenings or respond when you have, have blurred boundaries? I'm like, no, that's bad for their well-being. You should have clear boundaries, right? And then you give surveys to people like me, managers, and then they're like, oh, you have a work colleague. And then, Suzanne is responding to emails outside of working hours and the weekends. What do you think about Suzanne's commitment? And you're like, oh, yes, Suzanne's very committed. Suzanne is going to get the promotion. Suzanne is, really collegial. So there's this, again, another paradox we're finding where managers understand that, oh, for well-being, people should have clear boundaries. We all understand that. Like, that is a very accepted norm. What is also accepted is if even with colleagues ourselves, like if someone is pinging email to you back very quickly and in the weekends or when you want it, you think they're more collegial, you think they're more committed, and you're more likely to think they're more able to be promoted. So this is kind of the paradox, but this is very, very dangerous. We're really walking into this very dangerous thing. And of course, of those people, like forget about this side, let's focus on this side. It is the home workers who are doing a lot of that presenteeism here, because especially because you're not being seen by your managers in the office, you have to be seen on the online space, right? And it's also women and parents, especially mothers, who are doing more of this, because mothers are seen as being lacking capacity, lacking commitment. So what you need to do is you have to overperform in that digital space to be seen as productive. And it is ethnic minority workers who are more likely to do it, again for the same reason. Ethnic minority workers, unfortunately, are seen as not as committed, motivated, or not going to, really put their 100%. So you almost have to overcompensate, which again has huge implications for well-being issues. Oh, just these last two is just about, it's especially in the companies where it's a very long hours competitive culture, as well as if there's flexibility stimulant perceptions. So, okay, knowing all this, now this is kind of the last bit, where it's like, what do we need to think about work? So once we know that, okay, remote working, flexible working leads to longer hours, but also that strict bound, that's, that work also, means even beyond, like in terms of digitalization. And this graph here, I just wanted to show you is that this is, so the colored ones are post-pandemic and the empty ones are before the pandemic. And what this is showing is like the pandemic, people starting work earlier and finishing later, where kind of that mostly due to home working, that people are kind of getting that boundaries between the homes blurred, where work is encroaching on the private times. But the question arises, like, where do we even start saying what's just work time? So for example, when I said digital presenteeism, if I check my email first thing in the morning at 7 o'clock, does my clock tick? Did I just clock into work? If I work a little bit during the weekend, did I clock in? So I kind of feel like, and I'm not saying this because it makes me look very smart. I feel like we're in the Dadaism of work. It might be that my art history class was so bad that I don't understand what Dadaism is. But if I understand this correctly, for anyone who's into the art history, so Dadaism is a period of art where they were fooling around with what art is. So this is, the urinal, like that's like the idea of like, what is art? Is Dada art? Well, what's his name? It was a whole point of, is art if a work artist makes it? Is it art if it is done in an art studio? Is it art because it's pretty? Is it art because, and then there's a whole range of like, rabbit hole that you need to go through. And I kind of feel like now we're in the place of what is work? Is it work if it is done in an office? And I could first say, no. The little pie chart there and with all these things that you can't see is what people were actually doing when they were in the office pre-pandemic. And what you can see is that the red bit is the actual doing of work, but there was not very little work done. And those of you who work from home and now going back into the office will experience this. When you're going into the office, the amount of time you spend in the office not doing work is huge, right? You make coffee, you chat with friends, you have these meetings, were not really meetings, could have been an email, text messaging, baking food, reading the news. Well, smoking was actually, but essentially, when we started dividing working hours in the office, like it's actually not true. And what you're actually seeing is a lot of people when you're working from home, that they only then you're like, oh, but I put the laundry in for 2 seconds. Did that take my working hours? Like, no. Like you used to like bugger off to go get coffee for 30 minutes. How do you count that as working hours and not this? But essentially that the whole idea of working hours, especially when the space of work is not there, but also the timing and also because of this stuff, it becomes really, really difficult. And then the question is, then what do we measure? Should we then not measure working hours? Is working hours not important anymore? Because it just becomes so amorphous for so many of us, especially about digital presenteeism. What about multitasking? So one of the things you can do is use like time use surveys to see how much of it is tainted hours and not. But always, even with time use, it's really difficult because some of these things or the events are so short and small that you wouldn't be able to fully capture it. And of course, you're not going to get people the size of LFS to time use survey. That would cost too much money anyways. But then the question then is, and this is where a lot of people are now at, is that maybe it's not the working hours. Maybe for knowledge workers, we need to almost measure the break away from work. So that now we're almost accepting that work is, it's just gone everywhere. So, and in psychological theories, especially by Sonnentag and others and colleagues, they talk about psychological and mental detachment away from work. And if you look at the ILO conventions, there's this whole notion about rest times being very, very important. So maybe then you need to do the minus. So it's the kind of opposite, the opposite negative element. And maybe we have to talk about rest time. So how much hours are you able to actually rest away from work or break away from work? Is that better, worse? I don't have the answers. This is actually, now I've thrown the homework back to you. Now you need to solve this. Or the other thing, and this is related to this right to switch off, which is introduced in this very way right now in the UK, is stronger in the European Union, and has been introduced in France, Ireland, Portugal, etc. Is essentially, are we going to measure workers' ability to set up stronger boundaries without the fear of repercussion? So is it the subjective perception that you can have boundaries that is important? Of course, depends now on what are we measuring. Are we here to just measure work, or are we here to measure the outcomes of work in terms of well-being outcomes, etc., which is kind of coming out to here. And this figures, I'm sure you all know, is this whole work is hugely costly for society. I think now we have to understand that we talked about work having economic contributions to society, but at the same time, a lot of work is costing us a lot of money. Now, I think we need to be much more serious about measuring this, the social cost of work, as well as the social value of work, in addition to the economic value. So then what do you measure there? Like, do you measure the cost of work in terms of stress level, lack of stable work-life balance? Do you ask workers directly, or do I have? So here are some examples of that. Again, working conditions, talking about, like, just straight up ask, do you think your work is impacting you negatively? Yes, no, maybe. And I think the other one I forgot to mention is also, what's the social value of work other than the economic value? Obviously that, oh yeah, we can talk about, oh yeah, social care is valuable. Oh yeah, like maybe banking and finance can be valuable or not. Or maybe we could ask people, like, how much do you think your work is contributing to society and meaningful? Because I think meaningful at work, meaning at work also is huge. And of course it's subjective, because even within the same sector, same occupation, the job you do, how you do it, what you do has a different connotation. So I'm just going to end here.